He walked up to his master on a Tuesday morning and asked to be sold, not to escape, not in anger, not in desperation. He was calm. His hands were at his sides. His voice was steady. He looked Thomas Aldridge directly in the eye, which alone was enough to make the overseer reach for his whip, and he said, quietly and clearly, "I am asking you to sell me, sir, to the Harmon Plantation. I understand they are looking for skilled hands." Thomas Aldridge stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. No enslaved man asked to be sold. It did not happen. The entire architecture of the plantation system was built on the premise that enslaved people had no preferences, no plans, no interior life complex enough to generate a request like this. A man asking to be sold was like a hammer asking to be put in a different toolbox. It made no sense within the framework that Aldridge had built his entire life inside of. So he laughed, and he told the man to get back to work. And he forgot about it by noon. That was his mistake, the first of many. The man's name was Moses. He was 31 years old, born on Aldridge Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia, the son of a field worker named Daniel and a woman named Grace who had died when Moses was 4 years old. He had grown up on that land. He knew every inch of it, every path through the woods, every move of the river that ran along the eastern boundary, every face among the 240 enslaved people who lived and worked there. He was a blacksmith, the best one Aldridge had. His skill with iron so precise and so valuable that Aldridge had turned down 3 separate offers to purchase him over the years, each time at prices that would have represented a substantial profit. Moses knew he was valuable. He had understood this for years with the cold clarity of someone who has had to learn to see himself through the eyes of a system that reduces human beings to their market price. He knew that Aldridge would not sell him easily. He knew that a single request, calmly delivered on a Tuesday morning, would be laughed off. He had expected the laugh. He had planned for it, because Moses was not asking once. What was waiting at Harmon Plantation, 12 miles south of Aldridge, that Moses needed to reach badly enough to ask to be sold there? What was worth the humiliation of that request, the risk of the overseer's whip, the uncertainty of being transferred into the ownership of a man he had never met? The answer is a woman named Iris. But here's the thing about Iris that makes this story something other than a love story, though it is that too. Iris was not simply the woman Moses loved. Iris was the only living witness to something that Thomas Aldridge had done 9 years earlier, something that had destroyed a family and ended a life, and that Aldridge believed was buried so deeply in the past that nothing and no one could ever bring it into the light. He was wrong, and Moses knew he was wrong. And Moses had spent 3 years constructing a plan so precise, so patient, so completely invisible to everyone around him, that when it finally moved, it would move with the force of something that has been held back for a very long time. But first, he had to get to Iris. And getting to Iris meant getting sold. Aldridge Plantation sat on 4,000 acres of Virginia Piedmont, the land rolling in gentle hills covered with tobacco fields that had been worked by enslaved people for 3 generations of the Aldridge family. The main house was large and well-maintained, set back from the road behind a long avenue of elm trees that gave it an air of composed authority. Thomas Aldridge, the current master, was 44 years old, a man of medium height and considerable self-regard who served on the county court and attended church every Sunday with the visible enthusiasm of someone who needs to be seen attending church. He was respected in Hanover County. He was considered a fair man by the standards of his time and place, which meant he was considered fair by the people whose opinion he valued, which did not include anyone he owned. He had a secret. Most men of his position did. But his was larger than most and more specific, and it had a witness. One witness, who had been conveniently sold away from Aldridge Plantation 9 years ago to a property far enough away that her existence had faded from his daily awareness into a background hum of low-level anxiety that he had learned, over the years, to mostly ignore. Moses had not ignored it. Moses had been paying attention for 3 years, ever since the night that an old man named Cato, dying slowly in the corner of the quarters, had called Moses to his side and whispered him the thing he had been carrying alone for 9 years, the thing he had seen, the thing he could not prove, but that Moses, if he could get to Iris, might be able to turn into something that could not be ignored. Cato died 3 days later. Moses went back to his forge. He picked up his hammer, and he began a plan. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. If you are new here, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because what Moses built over the next 2 years at that forge, what he put in motion with a single calm request on a Tuesday morning, is one of the most extraordinary acts of calculated resistance in the history of American slavery. And we're only just getting started. Aldridge said no to the first request. Moses had expected that. He asked again 6 weeks later. Different approach this time. Not a direct request, but suggestion, delivered to the plantation's overseer. A man named Grady who Moses had spent 2 years cultivating with small, careful acts of usefulness. Moses told Grady that he had heard Harmon Plantation was willing to pay top dollar for a skilled blacksmith, that the number being mentioned was $600, considerably more than Moses' current assessed value, and that if Aldridge was interested in that kind of profit, Moses would not object to the arrangement. Grady passed it along. Aldridge listened this time, because $600 was not nothing. He told Grady he would think about it. That was the second request. The third request Moses never made directly at all. He simply arranged for Thomas Aldridge to overhear a conversation. Not a real conversation. A performance. Staged with the help of 2 other men in the quarters who owed Moses favors and who understood, without needing full details, that something important was happening. The conversation, which Aldridge overheard from behind the wall of the blacksmith shop while conducting what he believed was an unannounced inspection, concerned Moses' apparent eagerness to eventually earn his freedom and his plan to work extra hours to make himself more valuable, a plan that, well, the men said, Moses believed would be better pursued at a larger operation like Harmon, where the opportunities were greater. Aldridge heard a man trying to make himself worth more. He heard ambition pointed in a direction that could be profitable to him. He did not hear what was actually happening, because what was actually happening required an understanding of Moses that Aldridge had never bothered to develop. He agreed to the sale 4 days later. $620. He told himself he was getting the better end of the deal. Moses arrived at Harmon Plantation on a Thursday afternoon in October 1849, riding in the back of a wagon with 2 other men being transferred as part of the same transaction. He had 1 small bundle of possessions. He had the clothes on his back. He had, tucked inside the lining of his jacket in a space, he had sewn himself a single folded piece of paper, not a document, not evidence, a letter written by a free black preacher named Reverend Aldis, who traveled the county and who had agreed, after a long and careful conversation with Moses, to write down what Moses dictated to him. The letter was addressed to a man in Richmond named Cornelius Webb. Webb was a white lawyer, one of a very small number of men in Virginia in 1849 who had demonstrated, through specific past actions, a willingness to take certain kinds of cases that most of his colleagues would not touch. Moses had learned about Webb through a chain of information that had taken 18 months to assemble, each link requiring trust and care and the patient cultivation of connections across the invisible network that existed beneath the surface of Plantation, Virginia. He had never met Webb. He did not know if Webb would respond, but he had no other path available to him. So he had written the letter, and he had carried it sewn into his jacket, and he had gotten himself sold to a plantation 12 miles away, so that he could reach the one person who could make the letter mean something. That person was Iris. Iris was 36 years old, a woman of quiet and deliberate stillness that people who did not know her often mistook for passivity. She had been at Harmon Plantation for 9 years, sold there from Aldridge in 1840 under circumstances that she had never been given any explanation for, simply taken one morning and transferred, her life on Aldridge erased in an afternoon. She had built a new life at Harmon with the resilience of someone who has had to rebuild before and knows how it is done. She worked in the main house. She was trusted by the Harmon family in the limited and conditional way that trust operated in that world. She had said nothing about what she had seen 9 years ago, not because she had forgotten it, but because there was no one to tell, no mechanism by which the telling could lead anywhere other than back to her own destruction. When Moses arrived at Harmon and found a way to speak to her privately, 3 days after his arrival, she looked at him for a long time before she said anything. She had never met him before. He was a stranger who had gotten himself sold to reach her, which was either the action of someone with a serious plan or someone with a serious problem, and she needed to determine which before she said a single word. Moses told her about Cato, about what Cato had seen, about the letter in his jacket and the lawyer in Richmond, and the question of whether what she knew, combined with what Cato had described to Moses before he died, was enough to do what Moses believed it could do. Iris was quiet for a very long time after he finished. Then she said, "What Cato saw was true. I was there. I saw it too. I saw all of it." And then she told Moses exactly what had happened on that night 9 years ago at Aldridge Plantation. And as she spoke, Moses understood for the first time the full weight of what he had spent 3 years trying to reach. He had known it was serious. He had not known it was this serious. What Iris described was not merely a wrong done to one person. It was a crime, a specific, documentable, legally actionable crime that Thomas Aldridge had committed against a free man. A free black man named Joseph who had come to Aldridge Plantation in 1840 with his freedom papers in his hand, looking for work, and who had never left, not because he chose to stay, because Thomas Aldridge had taken his papers, destroyed them, and entered Joseph into his ledger as a newly purchased slave, pocketing the price of man he had stolen from freedom and forced into bondage. Joseph had died at Aldridge Plantation in 1843. Worked to death in the tobacco fields, his legal status as a free man buried under the weight of a ledger entry and the word of a county court judge against the word of no one, because no one who had witnessed what happened could speak without destroying themselves. Except now there were 2 witnesses, and there was a letter sewn into the lining of a jacket, and there was a lawyer in Richmond who had, twice before, taken cases that no one expected him to take. Moses looked at Iris across the small dark space where they were speaking, and he said, "Can you write down what you just told me?" Iris looked back at him. She said, "I have been able to write for 20 years. I have been waiting for someone to ask." The letter reached Cornelius Webb in Richmond in November 1849, carried there by Reverend Aldis on one of his regular circuit rides through the county. Webb read it once, set it down, picked it up and read it again. Then he sat for a long time looking out the window at the street below his office. He was 53 years old, a man who had practiced law in Virginia for nearly 30 years and who had, in that time, developed a highly calibrated sense of which battles could be won and which could not. He had taken 2 previous cases involving the illegal enslavement of free black men. He had won one and lost one. The loss had cost him clients, social standing, and 6 months of income. He had told himself after that loss that he would not do it again. He picked up the letter a 3rd time. He read the section that described what Iris had witnessed. He thought about Joseph, dead 6 years now, who had walked onto Aldridge Plantation with his freedom papers in his hand and had never walked off it. He thought about the specific details in the letter, the kind of details that do not exist in fabricated accounts, the kind that can only come from someone who was present. He wrote back to Reverend Aldis the following week. He had questions. He needed more information. He needed, specifically, a written account from the witness herself, signed and detailed, that he could use to begin building what would need to be an extremely careful and precisely constructed case. At Harmon Plantation, Moses received Webb's response through Reverend Aldis on his next visit. He read it standing at his forge, the iron cooling in his hand, and then he went to find Iris. What Iris produced over the following 3 weeks was extraordinary. She wrote in a clear, steady hand, in language that was precise and chronological and devastatingly specific, a full account of what she had witnessed on the night of March 14th, 1840. She described Thomas Aldridge's actions. She described Joseph. She described the papers. She described what was done with them. She described everything she had seen and heard, including specific words spoken that she had been holding in her memory for 9 years, preserved with the accuracy of someone who understood even then that she might one day need them. Moses smuggled the document out through Reverend Aldis. It reached Webb in December. Webb read it and understood immediately that he was holding something that was either going to be the most important document of his career or the most dangerous thing he had ever touched. Possibly both. He began building the case. What happened next unfolded over the better part of a year in the slow and procedural language of 19th century Virginia law, and it is worth understanding how extraordinary it was that it happened at all. Webb filed a petition in January 1850 on behalf of the estate of Joseph, a free man of color, deceased, alleging that Thomas Aldridge had illegally seized and enslaved a free person, citing specific evidence and naming a witness. The petition was initially rejected on procedural grounds. Webb refiled. It was rejected again. He appealed to a higher court. The higher court, by a margin of 1 judge, agreed to hear it. Thomas Aldridge learned about the petition in February 1850. He learned about it from his lawyer, who delivered the news with the expression of a man who has just discovered something unpleasant beneath a rock he did not expect to turn over. Aldridge's first response was dismissal. It was impossible. There were no witnesses. Anyone who might have been present that night had been sold away years ago, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of problem. Then his lawyer told him about Iris, about the written account, about the specific details it contained. Aldridge went very still. He asked his lawyer to read him the specific details from the petition. His lawyer read them. Aldridge sat back in his chair and his face went through several different expressions before settling on something that was not quite fear, but was moving rapidly in that direction. He said, "That is not possible. She cannot have remembered all of that." His lawyer looked at him across the desk and said nothing. Aldridge's case collapsed over the following 8 months with the grim inevitability of something built on a foundation that was always going to fail. Webb was meticulous, patient, and in possession of a witness whose account held up under every challenge his opponents could devise. The court proceedings were not public in any broad sense. Virginia in 1850 had no interest in broadcasting a case that raised uncomfortable questions about the reliability of the legal machinery that held the entire system in place. But the outcome was unavoidable once the evidence was fully presented. Thomas Aldridge was found to have illegally enslaved a free man. The judgment against him was financial, a substantial sum to be paid to Joseph's surviving family, located after months of searching in Pennsylvania. 2 sisters who had believed their brother simply disappeared and who received the news of what had actually happened to him in a lawyer's letter that one of them later described as the most devastating thing she had ever read. Aldridge also lost his position on the county court. He lost the social standing he had spent his life constructing. He sold portions of his plantation to cover the judgment. He lived the remaining 11 years of his life as a diminished man in a county that had quietly decided it no longer wished to know him. Moses remained at Harmon Plantation. He had accomplished what he came to do when he was, in the practical terms of his existence, still an enslaved man with no immediate path to freedom. He went back to his forge. He picked up his hammer. He continued his work. But something had shifted, not in his legal status, not in the external conditions of his life. Something internal. Something that is difficult to name precisely, but that the people around him noticed in the weeks and months after the case concluded. A quality in him that had always been present but that had been held tightly, compressed by the years of waiting and planning, had released. He moved differently. He occupied his own presence differently. The overseer at Harmon, a man named Briggs who was not perceptive about most things, but who was perceptive about people, described it to his wife one evening as, "Moses looks like a man who has finished something." That is exactly what he was. A man who had spent 3 years building something invisible and patient and precise, who had gotten himself sold to reach the one person he needed, who had carried a letter sewn into his jacket lining across 12 miles of Virginia, and who had set in motion, from inside a system designed to give him no power whatsoever, a chain of events that had ended the public life of the man who deserved it. Iris was granted her freedom in 1853. Through a provision in Harmon's will that no one had expected, and that Webb had had nothing to do with, as far as anyone knew, she moved to Philadelphia. She taught school for 30 years. She never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed or what she had written, though she spoke of it privately to people she trusted. And those conversations are how fragments of this story survived. Moses was freed in 1856 by an act that the record describes only as voluntary manumission by the Harmon estate, with no further explanation. He was 38 years old. He moved to Ohio. He set up a blacksmith shop in Cincinnati that operated for 22 years. His work, by all accounts, was extraordinary. There is one final detail. Among the few possessions Moses carried when he left Harmon Plantation in 1856 was his jacket, the same one he had worn the day he arrived 7 years earlier. The lining had been re-sewn at some point, the hidden compartment closed, but the jacket was kept. It was found among his belongings when he died in 1878, carefully folded, set apart from his other clothing in a way that suggested it was not kept for practical reasons. He kept it because of what it had carried, because of what it had meant to carry it, because some objects hold inside them the memory of the moment when everything changed, and you do not throw those away.